Sometimes the most powerful act of love is choosing to stand up when everyone else bows down. Sometimes it takes losing everything to discover what truly matters in this world. Astrid was supposed to marry a cruel Jarl who saw her as property. When she refused to submit, he threw her out into a deadly blizzard, wearing only her wedding dress. Left to die in the snow, she crawled through the wilderness until she collapsed at the door of Eirik Stoneborn, a giant warrior who lived alone in the mountains. What happened next changed everything. Eirik didn't just save her life, he chose to protect her against the most feared man in the region. One small act of kindness sparked a rebellion that would shake the entire kingdom. But would their growing love be strong enough to survive what was coming? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning mist clung to the fjords like the breath of sleeping giants, and in the great hall of Jarl, Magnus Ironwolf, the scent of roasted meat and sour ale could not mask the underlying smell of fear that had settled into the very timbers of the building. Fear had a particular odor, sharp, metallic, like blood left too long in the cold, and it had become as familiar to the people of Ravenshollow as the salt spray from the nearby sea. Astrid Thornsdottir stood before the polished bronze mirror in the small chamber that had been her prison for the past 3 days, her reflection wavering like a ghost in the unsteady metal surface. The wedding dress they had forced upon her was beautiful in the way that chains can be beautiful, intricate silver embroidery, traced patterns across deep blue silk, each thread placed with the precision of a master craftsman, each stitch a reminder of the wealth and power that would soon own her completely. Her fingers traced the delicate beadwork along the bodice, and she remembered her mother's gentle hands teaching her the same patterns when she was barely tall enough to reach the loom. Those had been different times, when her father Thorin still lived and their small farmstead rang with laughter instead of silence. Before the raids that took everything, before the debts that could only be paid with flesh and bone and a daughter's freedom, beautiful as the morning star, came a voice from the doorway, though the words carried no warmth. Astrid didn't need to turn to recognize the gravelly tone of Jarl Magnus. She had heard that voice in her nightmares for weeks now, ever since the marriage contract had been signed in her absence, her future bartered away like grain at market. She turned slowly, keeping her face composed in the way her mother had taught her. Never let them see the storm inside, little star, for they will use it as a weapon against you. Magnus stood in the doorway, his massive frame filling the space completely. At 53 winters, he remained formidable, though time and countless battles had taken their toll. Grey streaked his once golden beard, and a jagged scar ran from his left temple to his jaw, a permanent reminder of some long-forgotten conflict. But it was his eyes that made grown men step aside, cold as winter seas, calculating as a merchant weighing gold. "My lord," Astrid said, offering the slightest bow that courtesy demanded, and no more. Magnus stepped into the chamber, and Astrid caught the scent that always surrounded him, leather and steel and something else, something that reminded her of wolves before they struck. He moved with the confidence of a man who had never been denied anything he wanted, each step deliberate and possessive. "Nervous about tonight?" he asked, though his tone suggested he cared little for her comfort. "It's natural for a maiden to feel—" "I am not nervous, my lord," Astrid interrupted, her voice steady despite the way her heart hammered against her ribs. "I am unwilling." The temperature in the room seemed to drop several degrees. Magnus's eyes narrowed, and for a moment the mask of civilized behavior slipped, revealing something predatory underneath. Then he smiled, and somehow that was worse than his anger. "Unwilling," he repeated, as if tasting the word. "How refreshing. Do you know how long it's been since anyone in this hall spoke to me with such honesty?" He moved closer, and Astrid forced herself not to step back. Retreat would only encourage him. "Your father understood the necessity of this arrangement." Magnus continued, his voice dropping to an almost intimate whisper. Your family's debts, the protection I can offer your village, the prosperity that comes from my favor. These are not small considerations. My father is dead, Astrid said quietly. He cannot speak for what he understood, but he can speak through the contracts he signed, through the promises he made. Magnus reached out and touched a strand of her copper-colored hair, and Astrid felt her skin crawl. You are his daughter. His debt becomes yours, and his wisdom should guide you. Astrid pulled away from his touch, and this time she didn't try to hide her revulsion. My father's wisdom taught me that some prices are too high to pay, even for survival. Magnus laughed, a sound like rocks grinding together. Survival? Child, you think too small. This is about empire, about legacy, about securing your place in a world that devours the weak. His hand moved to her chin, forcing her to meet his gaze. You will bear my sons, strong sons who will carry my name and expand my holdings. In return, you will want for nothing. Comfort, protection, respect, all can be yours. And if I refuse? The question hung in the air like smoke from a dying fire. Magnus's smile widened, showing teeth that were still strong despite his age. Refuse? He spoke the word as if it were a foreign concept. My dear girl, that option ceased to exist the moment your father's seal touched the marriage contract. Tonight you will stand before the priest and the assembled Jarls. You will speak the vows. You will take my name and my protection. The only choice remaining is whether you do so willingly or whether I must remind you of the alternatives. He stepped back, straightening his rich furs. Your village looks to you as an example. Your younger cousins, your aunt who raised you after your parents' death, they all depend on my continued goodwill. Surely you wouldn't want them to suffer for your girlish fantasies of romance. The threat was clear, wrapped in silk but sharp as any blade. Astrid had seen what happened to those who crossed Magnus Ironwolf, families torn apart, men who disappeared in the night, farms that burned while their owners slept. He ruled through fear because fear was reliable in a way that love or loyalty could never be. I understand perfectly, Astrid said, her voice carefully neutral. Good. The ceremony begins at sunset. Don't keep me waiting. When Magnus left, taking his oppressive presence with him, Astrid sank onto the simple wooden chair beside the window. Outside, she could see the preparations for the wedding feast, servants hurrying between buildings, smoke rising from cooking fires, banners bearing Magnus's wolf sigil snapping in the cold wind. Everything proceeding exactly as planned, as if her consent were merely an interesting detail rather than the foundation of a life. She thought of her parents, dead these 5 years now. Her father had been a good man, honest in his dealings, and generous with what little they had. But goodness was a luxury in a world shaped by violence, and when the raiders came for their livestock and grain, honest men died just as easily as anyone else. Her mother had lasted only 2 seasons after that, grief eating away at her like a slow poison until one morning she simply didn't wake up. Astrid had been barely 18 then, left in the care of her father's sister who lived in the main village. Aunt Sigrid had tried her best, but they all knew the truth. A woman alone in this world was prey, and it was only a matter of time before someone with power decided to claim her. Now, that time had come. She moved to the wooden chest beside the bed and lifted the lid. Inside, wrapped carefully in oiled cloth, was the only thing of value she truly owned, her mother's silver brooch, passed down through generations of women in her family. It was simple but beautiful, depicting a tree with spreading branches and deep roots, its surface worn smooth by countless hands. For strength, she whispered, pinning the brooch to her wedding dress just over her heart. For remembering who I truly am, no matter what name they force me to take. Outside, the sun was beginning its descent toward the mountains. Soon the ceremony would begin, and with it, a life she had never chosen. But as she stood there in the fading light, Astrid made herself a promise. They could take her name, her freedom, even her body, but they could not take her spirit. That belonged to her alone, and she would guard it more fiercely than any warrior ever guarded gold. The sound of approaching footsteps echoed in the corridor outside her chamber. Soon, someone would come to escort her to the great hall, where Magnus waited with his priests and his contracts and his absolute certainty that he could possess another human soul as easily as he might claim a horse or a sword. But possessing and owning were different things, and Astrid intended to make sure that Magnus learned that distinction, no matter the cost. She touched the silver brooch again, feeling its familiar weight against her chest, and began to plan her refusal. The wedding dress suddenly felt less like chains and more like armor. Tonight she would make her choice known to everyone present. Tonight she would choose dignity over safety, truth over survival. Tonight everything would change. The great hall of Ravenshollow had never seen such finery. Tapestries from distant lands hung from the rafters, their rich colours catching the light of 100 torches. Long tables groaned under the weight of roasted boar, honeyed bread, and wine that had crossed oceans to reach this remote fjord. The assembled Jarls wore their finest furs and most precious weapons, each one a reminder of the power gathered in this single room. Astrid stood at the threshold, flanked by two of Magnus's most trusted men. The hall fell silent as she appeared, 300 pairs of eyes turning to assess the bride who would soon join their ranks. She walked forward with measured steps, her mother's brooch catching the firelight with each movement, her chin held high despite the weight of so many stares. Magnus waited at the far end of the hall, dressed in ceremonial armor polished to mirror brightness. The wolf pelts draped across his shoulders had been taken from his first hunt as a boy, their silver-grey fur now faded but still magnificent. Beside him stood Father Jarl, the old priest whose weathered hands had blessed countless unions and whose tired eyes had seen too many brides who looked exactly as Astrid did now. The crowd parted as she approached, creating a path lined with faces both familiar and strange. She recognized some villagers from her own settlement, their expressions carefully neutral. They understood the bargain being struck here, their safety purchased with her freedom. Others were warriors and jarls from neighboring regions, men who had traveled days to witness this alliance and judge its strength. When she reached the altar, Magnus extended his hand. For a moment that stretched like an eternity, Astrid stared at that outstretched palm, calloused from decades of sword work, adorned with rings that represented conquered territories and defeated enemies. This was the moment of choice, the final step across a threshold from which there could be no return. She placed her hand in his and felt the crowd release a collective breath. Father Jarl began the ancient words, his voice carrying the weight of tradition and the authority of gods whose names were older than memory. We gather tonight to witness the joining of two houses, two lives, two destinies. Jarl Magnus Ironwolf, do you take this woman as your lawful wife, to honor and protect according to the customs of our people? I do, Magnus replied, his voice carrying easily through the hall. The priest turned to Astrid, and in his eyes she saw something unexpected, sympathy perhaps, or simply the weariness of a man who had performed this ritual too many times for brides who had no choice in their fate. Astrid Thorn's daughter, do you take this man as your lawful husband, to honor and obey according to the customs of our people? The hall fell completely silent. Even the torches seemed to burn more quietly, as if the very air were holding its breath. This was the moment Magnus had been so certain of, the inevitable conclusion to weeks of negotiation and arrangement. Astrid looked out over the assembled crowd, seeing faces that ranged from hopeful to anxious to coldly calculating. She thought of her aunt Sigrid, probably pacing in her small cottage, praying to whatever gods might listen that her niece would be wise enough to submit. She thought of her younger cousins, children who depended on Magnus's protection for their very survival. Then she thought of her parents, buried in the small graveyard overlooking the sea. Her father, who had taught her that honor mattered more than comfort. Her mother, who had whispered stories of warrior queens and shield maidens who chose their own paths regardless of the consequences. "No," she said quietly. The word carried despite its softness, cutting through the silence like a blade through silk. A ripple of shock ran through the crowd, whispers beginning immediately before dying away as Magnus raised his hand. "I'm sorry," Father Jarl said, leaning forward as if he might have misheard. "Could you speak more clearly, child?" Astrid pulled her hand free from Magnus's grip and turned to face the assembled crowd. When she spoke again, her voice rang clear and strong, carrying to every corner of the hall. "I said no. I will not take this man as my husband. I will not honor him or obey him or pretend that this arrangement is anything other than what it truly is. The sale of a woman like livestock at market." The reaction was immediate and explosive. Jarls shot to their feet, hands moving instinctively to sword hilts. Women gasped behind their hands. Men who had traveled days to witness this alliance began shouting questions and demands. Through it all, Magnus remained perfectly still, his face a mask of controlled fury. "You forget yourself, girl," he said, his voice cutting through the chaos like winter wind. The hall gradually quieted, though the tension remained thick as smoke. "You forget what you owe, what your family owes, what your village depends upon." "I forget nothing," Astrid replied. "I remember exactly what my father taught me about debts and honor. A debt that can only be paid with human flesh is no debt at all. It's slavery dressed in prettier words." Magnus stepped closer, and for the first time since she'd known him, she saw his mask slip completely. The civilized Jarl disappeared, replaced by something predatory and dangerous. "Your father signed a contract," he said, each word precise and sharp. His mark, his seal, his promise that his daughter would fulfill the terms of the agreement. "Are you calling your father a liar and a cheat?" "I'm calling him a man who made a bargain he had no right to make. I am not property to be traded. I am not a broodmare to produce heirs for your empire. I am a person, and I choose not to bind my life to yours." The crowd was on its feet now, the carefully orchestrated ceremony dissolving into chaos. Some shouted support for tradition and contract law, others seemed stunned by the unprecedented breach of protocol. Through it all, Magnus's warriors began moving, positioning themselves strategically around the hall. "You choose," Magnus repeated, his voice dropping to a whisper that somehow carried more menace than any shout. "Let me tell you about choices, Astrid Thornsdottir. You can walk to the altar willingly and speak the vows as planned, or you can be dragged there. The words will be the same either way. The only words I'll speak are the truth," Astrid said. "And the truth is that I reject this marriage, I reject you, and I reject any agreement made without my consent." Magnus's hand moved to his sword, and the hall fell silent again. For a heartbeat, Astrid thought he might actually draw steel in his own wedding ceremony. Then he smiled, and that somehow was worse than any blade. "Very well," he said. "You want to make choices. Here's one for you. Agree to the marriage now, or I'll have your aunt dragged from her home tonight, your cousins too. We'll see how long your precious dignity lasts when you're listening to them scream." The threat hit Astrid like a physical blow, driving the breath from her lungs. Around the hall, she could see Magnus's men nodding, already knowing their orders. This wasn't an idle threat, it was a promise, delivered with the casual certainty of a man who had never been successfully opposed. But instead of breaking her resolve, the threat crystallized something inside Astrid that had been building all her life. Every time she'd been told to be grateful for scraps, every time she'd been expected to smile while men decided her fate, every time she'd been reminded that her only value lay in what she could provide for others. "Then you'll have to live with that choice," she said, pulling the silver brooch from her dress and holding it high. "But I will not be party to it. I will not pretend that threatening innocent people makes you strong, or that terrorizing women makes you a man worth following." She threw the brooch at his feet, where it landed with a clear, musical sound that seemed to ring through the sudden silence. "I reject this marriage. Magnus Ironwolf, I reject you, and I reject any man who thinks he can own another person's soul. What happened next would be remembered and retold for generations. Magnus, his face purple with rage, gestured to his guards. But instead of forcing her to the altar, he pointed toward the great doors of the hall. "Take her," he snarled. "Strip her of everything except that wedding dress she's so proud of. Throw her into the storm. Let her precious dignity keep her warm while she freezes to death in the snow." As rough hands seized her arms, Astrid felt a strange sense of peace settle over her. She had made her choice, spoken her truth, and refused to compromise her soul for safety. Whatever came next, she would face it as herself, not as Magnus's possession. The last thing she heard as they dragged her toward the doors was the sound of the silver brooch being crushed under Magnus's boot. The blizzard struck Astrid like a living thing, tearing at her wedding dress with claws of ice and wind. The great doors of Magnus's hall slammed shut behind her with a sound like thunder, cutting off the warmth and light and leaving her alone in a world that had turned hostile in the space of a heartbeat. Snow swirled around her in spirals that seemed almost deliberate, as if the storm itself were a creature determined to claim her life. The silk of her dress, so beautiful in the firelight of the hall, became a mockery in the brutal cold, thin as gossamer, offering no protection against the elements that clawed at her skin. Within moments, her feet were numb in the delicate slippers that had been chosen for dancing, not for survival. She stumbled forward, driven more by instinct than plan. Behind her, the warm glow of the hall windows grew dim, then disappeared entirely as the snow thickened. The wind howled with a voice that seemed to carry the laughter of Magnus and his men, celebrating her foolishness even as she fought for each breath. The wedding dress, once pristine blue silk with silver embroidery, began to darken with moisture and mud as she fell repeatedly in the deepening drifts. Each time she struggled to her feet, the fabric tore a little more, her knees and palms bleeding where sharp ice cut through cloth and skin alike. The cold was unlike anything she had ever experienced, not merely the absence of warmth, but something actively malevolent that sought to steal the life from her bones. She tried to remember the layout of the settlement, to orient herself toward some kind of shelter, but the storm had transformed the familiar landscape into an alien wilderness. Landmarks disappeared behind curtains of driving snow. Paths she had walked since childhood became invisible trenches that sent her tumbling into hidden rocks and fallen logs. The world had become a maze with only one exit, and she was running out of time to find it. Her thoughts began to fragment as the cold seeped deeper. She found herself thinking of her wedding dress as if it belonged to someone else, wondering absently why that poor woman had chosen such impractical clothing for a walk in a blizzard. Then she would remember where she was and why, and terror would give her strength for a few more steps before the cold reclaimed her. Time became meaningless. She might have been walking for minutes or hours. The storm created its own twilight that made day and night indistinguishable. Her fingers had long since lost all feeling, and she could no longer tell if she was still gripping the fabric of her dress or if her hands had simply frozen in place. Her breath came in sharp gasps that turned to ice crystals before they could warm the air around her face. When she fell the final time, it felt different from all the others. This time, she didn't immediately struggle to rise. The snow beneath her was soft, almost welcoming, and the wind seemed to quiet just slightly, as if the storm were satisfied that it had finally claimed its prize. She could feel warmth beginning to spread through her limbs, not real warmth, she knew dimly, but the dangerous warmth that came at the end, when the body began to shut down to preserve what little life remained. She thought of her parents again, wondering if they would be disappointed in her choice. Perhaps she should have married Magnus, borne his children, found what happiness she could in the small corners he might have allowed her to keep. At least then, her family would be safe, her cousins would grow up protected, and her aunt could sleep without fear of midnight raids. But even as the thought formed, she rejected it. Some things mattered more than survival. Some truths were worth dying for. She had spoken honestly in that hall, perhaps for the first time in her life, and if that honesty cost her everything, at least she would die as herself rather than as Magnus's possession. The snow continued to fall, beginning to cover her prone form like a burial shroud. She could feel it settling on her back, her hair, her outstretched arms. Soon she would be just another mound in the landscape, her rebellion ended before it could truly begin. Future generations would never know that a woman had once chosen dignity over safety, that someone had stood up to Magnus Ironwolf and refused to bend. But as consciousness began to slip away, she felt something solid beneath her grasping fingers. Not snow or ice or the rough bark of a fallen tree, but something smooth and worked by human hands. Her eyes, heavy with exhaustion and cold, struggled to focus on what she had found. It was a piece of carved wood, partially buried in the drift where she had fallen. Even in her diminished state, she could see the craftsmanship that had gone into its making, flowing lines that suggested movement, symbols etched with care and precision. It was a fragment of something larger, broken off from its original whole, but still beautiful in its own right. With the last of her strength, Astrid closed her fingers around the carving. It was a small thing to hold on to as she died, but it felt important somehow. Someone had made this with their own hands, had taken time and care to create beauty in a world that often seemed determined to destroy it. Perhaps that was what mattered, not the grand gestures or the dramatic defiances, but the small acts of creation that said, in the face of everything, I was here, I mattered, I made something beautiful. The warmth was spreading faster now, and her eyelids felt impossibly heavy. Snow continued to fall, each flake a tiny weight that brought her closer to the end. She could no longer feel the wooden carving in her hand, though she hoped her fingers still held it. It would be nice to think that even in death, she grasped something that spoke of human hope and artistry. Her last coherent thought was a prayer to her mother, asking forgiveness for the pain her choice would cause. Then darkness took her, gentle as a lover's touch, and Astrid Thornsdottir surrendered to the storm that Magnus had sent to claim her life. Above her, the wind continued to howl, piling snow higher around her still form. But the wooden carving remained clutched in her frozen fingers, a fragment of something larger, broken but not destroyed, waiting like its holder for whatever dawn might bring. In the distance, barely visible through the storm, a light flickered in a window that few knew existed. Someone else was awake in this frozen wilderness, someone who understood that the most dangerous storms were often the ones that taught the most important lessons about survival, about choice, and about the price of standing against those who believed they could own the world. Eirik Stoneborn had always been a light sleeper. 20 years of living alone in the mountains had taught him to pay attention to sounds that didn't belong, the crack of a branch that might signal approaching predators, the whistle of wind that carried unfamiliar scents, the subtle changes in the storm's rhythm that could mean the difference between a harsh night and a deadly one. Tonight something was different. The blizzard raged with unusual fury, but beneath its howling voice he caught fragments of another sound. Human voices, perhaps, carried on the wind from the direction of Ravenshollow. He had heard rumors of a wedding planned for this night, some political alliance that would strengthen Magnus Ironwolf's grip on the surrounding territories. Such celebrations usually lasted well into the following day, with enough drinking and feasting to drown out the storm's voice. But these sounds were wrong, too sharp, too urgent. They spoke of conflict rather than celebration. Eirik rose from his seat beside the fire, his massive frame unfolding with the careful precision of a man who had learned to move quietly despite his size. At 6.5 feet tall, with shoulders that could have been carved from the mountains themselves, he was the kind of presence that filled a room simply by existing. His dark hair, streaked with premature silver, was bound back with leather cord, and his beard carried the same early frost that marked men who had seen too much violence too young. He pulled on his heaviest furs and stepped out into the storm. The wind struck him like a physical blow, driving snow into his eyes and mouth, but he had weathered worse. His cabin sat on a shelf of rock that provided some protection from the worst of the weather, and from here he could see the distant glow of Magnus's hall when the air was clear. Tonight, that glow seemed dimmer than usual, and the sounds he had heard were already fading into the storm's voice. Eirik had built his home here precisely because it was isolated, far from the politics and cruelties that seemed to follow Magnus wherever he went. After the massacre at Birchwood, where he had watched friends die for refusing to participate in the slaughter of civilians, he had walked away from the warrior's life and never looked back. The mountains offered peace, solitude, and the chance to remember what it felt like to be human, rather than a weapon pointed at whatever target Magnus chose. But as he scanned the white landscape below, something caught his eye. A disturbance in the snow near the base of the slope, something that moved with too much purpose to be debris blown by the wind. He squinted through the driving flakes, trying to make sense of what he was seeing. There, a flash of blue among the white, barely visible but distinctly out of place. Then it disappeared, swallowed by a drift, or perhaps simply by his own wishful thinking. But the image lingered, and with it came an uncomfortable certainty that someone was out there in the storm. Someone who probably wouldn't survive until dawn. Eirik retrieved his walking stick, a gnarled piece of ironwood that had saved his life more than once, and began the treacherous descent toward where he thought he had seen movement. The slope was treacherous even in good weather, made deadly by the ice and driving snow. Each step required careful consideration, his stick probing ahead to test the stability of the ground. The wind fought him every step of the way, threatening to send him tumbling into the rocks below. More than once he considered turning back, telling himself that whatever he had seen was probably just his imagination playing tricks in the storm. But something drove him forward, perhaps the memory of other nights when someone might have been looking for him in the darkness, when a helping hand could have meant the difference between survival and death. When he finally reached the base of the slope, the blue flash was gone. For a long moment he stood in the swirling snow, questioning his decision to leave the warmth of his fire for this fool's errand. Then his stick struck something soft beneath the snow, something that gave way under pressure rather than resisting like rock or fallen wood. He dropped to his knees and began brushing away the accumulation with his bare hands. What he uncovered made his breath catch in his throat, despite years of witnessing violence and suffering. A young woman lay curled in the snow, her body partially covered by what had once been an elaborate wedding dress. The silk was torn and stained, the delicate embroidery ruined by ice and blood, but he could still see the quality of the work, the care that had gone into its creation. More importantly, she was still breathing. Barely, her chest rising and falling in shallow gasps that sent small puffs of vapor into the frigid air. Her skin was pale as the snow around her, her lips tinged with the blue that spoke of advanced cold exposure. In her hand, she clutched something small and dark, a piece of carved wood that she held with the desperation of someone grasping their last hope. Eirik didn't hesitate. He swept the woman into his arms, wedding dress and all, feeling how light she had become, how the cold had stolen the substance from her body. She was young, perhaps 20 winters, with hair the color of burnished copper that spilled across his arm like liquid fire. Even unconscious and half-frozen, there was something in her face that spoke of strength, of a spirit that refused to yield even when the body had reached its limits. The climb back to his cabin was a nightmare of ice and wind, and the constant fear that he might slip and send them both tumbling to their deaths. The woman's weight, negligible though it was, threw off his balance and made every step a calculated risk. But he had carried wounded comrades from battlefields before, had learned the careful art of moving with precious cargo through dangerous terrain. By the time he reached his door, his own clothing was soaked through and his muscles ached from the effort, but the woman in his arms was still breathing, and that was what mattered. Whatever had brought her to his doorstep in the middle of the worst storm in years, whoever had cast her out into the wilderness wearing nothing but silk and determination, she had survived. She had fought her way through the darkness to find help, and now it was his responsibility to make sure that fight hadn't been in vain. He kicked open the door and stepped into the blessed warmth of his cabin, already planning the careful process of warming her body without shocking her system. Outside, the storm continued its assault on the mountain, but here in his sanctuary, a different kind of battle was about to begin, the fight to save a life that someone else had clearly been eager to end. Inside the cabin, Eirik worked with the methodical precision of someone who had seen what happened when haste replaced careful judgment. The woman, he still didn't know her name, lay unconscious on his bed, her breathing so shallow it was almost imperceptible. Her skin had taken on the waxy pallor that marked the final stages of cold exposure, and when he touched her wrist to check for a pulse, her flesh felt like marble. The first priority was removing the wet clothing. The wedding dress, beautiful as it might have been in Magnus's great hall, had become a death shroud in the storm. The silk held moisture against her skin, conducting cold deeper into her body with every moment it remained. Eirik cut the fabric away with his knife, trying to preserve her modesty while working quickly enough to save her life. As he worked, he couldn't help but notice the bruises that marked her arms and shoulders, dark fingerprints where hands had gripped too tightly, evidence of rough treatment that had nothing to do with the storm. Whoever this woman was, she hadn't simply wandered into the blizzard by accident. She had been driven out, cast away like refuse, left to die in the darkness. He wrapped her in furs from his own bed, layer upon layer of wolf and bear pelts that trapped warmth close to her body. Then came the delicate process of warming her gradually too fast, and her body might go into shock, her heart might simply stop from the sudden change. He built up the fire until the cabin filled with blessed heat, then began massaging her hands and feet to restore circulation. The carved wooden fragment she had been clutching fell from her fingers as he worked, and he examined it in the firelight. It was beautifully made, part of what might have been a larger sculpture, broken off, but still showing the skill of its creator. The wood was dark with age and wear, and the symbols carved into its surface seemed to shift in the dancing flames. He set it on the table beside the bed, where she would see it when she woke, if she woke. Hours passed in careful vigilance. Eirik alternated between tending the fire and checking her pulse, between preparing warm broth and watching for signs of consciousness. Outside, the storm showed no signs of abating, but here in his sanctuary, wrapped in furs and surrounded by warmth, the woman began to show subtle signs of improvement. Color started to return to her lips, and her breathing deepened slightly. It was near dawn when she finally stirred. Her eyelids fluttered, and she made a small sound that might have been distress or confusion. Eirik moved carefully into her line of sight, not wanting to startle someone who had clearly endured trauma. "You're safe," he said quietly, his voice deliberately calm and unthreatening. "The storm is still raging, but you're warm and protected now." Her eyes opened fully green as summer leaves, bright with intelligence despite her ordeal. For a moment she stared at him without recognition, and he could see her mind working to piece together where she was and how she had gotten there. She began, then stopped, her voice barely a whisper. She tried to sit up, realized she was wearing nothing but furs, and pulled the coverings more tightly around herself. "Easy," Eirik said, reaching for a cup of warm broth he had kept ready. "You've been unconscious for hours. Your body needs time to recover from the cold." She accepted the broth gratefully, her hands shaking slightly as she held the cup. The warmth seemed to help, and after a few sips, her voice grew stronger. "You saved my life," she said, meeting his eyes directly. "I remember falling in the snow, thinking I was going to die there. How did you find me?" "I heard something in the storm. Voices, maybe conflict. I went to investigate and saw movement in the snow." He gestured toward the window, where grey daylight was beginning to filter through the continuing snowfall. "What's your name?" "Astrid," she replied, then seemed to hesitate, as if deciding whether to reveal more. "Astrid Thornsdotter." Eirik felt something cold settle in his stomach that had nothing to do with the weather outside. He knew that name, had heard it spoken in hushed tones around Magnus's hall. The bride who was supposed to seal some important alliance, the woman whose marriage would strengthen the Jarl's hold on the surrounding territories. "You were supposed to marry Magnus last night," he said, and it wasn't a question. Astrid's hands tightened on the cup, and for a moment her composure cracked, revealing the fear and exhaustion beneath. "I refused," she said simply. "I stood before the assembled Jarls and rejected the marriage. Magnus had me thrown out into the storm to die." The casual brutality of it struck Eirik like a physical blow. He had known Magnus was ruthless, had seen firsthand how the Jarl dealt with those who opposed him, but this seemed excessive even by those standards. To condemn a woman to death simply for refusing marriage, it spoke of a cruelty that went beyond political necessity into something darker. "Why?" he asked, genuinely curious. "You must have known what would happen. Magnus doesn't tolerate defiance, especially public defiance." Astrid was quiet for a long moment, staring into the fire as if seeking answers in the flames. "Because some things matter more than survival," she said finally. "Because I couldn't live with myself if I became the kind of person who would smile and submit and pretend that being owned was the same thing as being loved." She looked at him then, and he saw strength in those green eyes that reminded him of his own moment of choice when he had walked away from Magnus's service rather than participate in the massacre at Birchwood. The same refusal to compromise fundamental principles for the sake of safety or comfort. "You understand, don't you?" she continued. "I heard stories about you, about why you left the Jarl's service. People say you walked away from wealth and position because you couldn't stomach what was being done in Magnus's name." Eirik nodded slowly. "People say many things. Not all of them are true, but that part is." He met her gaze steadily. "That part is." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching the fire and listening to the storm outside. Two people who had made difficult choices, who had chosen principles over pragmatism and paid prices that most would consider too high. "What happens now?" Astrid asked eventually. "Magnus will assume I died in the storm. When he discovers I survived, what then?" "Now you rest," Eirik said firmly. "You heal. You regain your strength. Everything else can wait until you're ready to face it." But even as he spoke the words, he knew they were both thinking the same thing. Magnus Ironwolf had built his power on the certainty that resistance was futile, that defiance would always be crushed. If word spread that a woman had publicly rejected him and lived to tell about it, others might begin to believe that standing against him was possible. That kind of hope, Eirik knew, was exactly what Magnus feared most. 3 days passed before the storm finally exhausted itself, leaving behind a world transformed by snow and ice. During those days, Astrid recovered her strength while learning the rhythms of Eirik's solitary life. The cabin was larger than it had seemed at first, built with the skill of someone who understood both craftsmanship and the harsh realities of mountain winters. She discovered that Eirik was not simply a warrior who had chosen exile. His hands, when not wielding weapons, created things of surprising beauty. The walls were lined with wooden carvings, animals caught in motion, trees that seemed to sway in invisible wind, abstract patterns that spoke of deep contemplation and patient work. The carved fragment she had clutched in the snow was clearly his work, part of a larger piece that had broken off during some long-ago accident. "You made this," she said, holding up the fragment on the morning when sunlight finally broke through the clouds. Eirik looked up from the knife he was sharpening, his expression carefully neutral. "Years ago. It was part of a larger work that didn't survive well. What was it meant to be? He was quiet for a long moment, and she thought he might not answer. Then he set down the knife and moved to a wooden chest in the corner of the cabin. From it, he withdrew several other pieces, fragments of what had clearly been a magnificent sculpture, each piece carved with the same skill and attention to detail. "A tree," he said, arranging the pieces on the table so she could see how they might have once fit together. "The world tree, Yggdrasil. I worked on it during my first winter here, when the isolation was hardest to bear. It was meant to be something beautiful, something that connected earth and sky. Astrid could see it in her mind, the way the pieces would have created flowing lines and organic curves, a sense of life and growth captured in dark wood. What happened to it? "Menver, we do that sign of the duck. I broke it myself," Eirik admitted, his voice carrying old pain. "During a particularly dark time, when the memories of what I'd done in Magnus's service wouldn't leave me alone, I thought destroying it might help, might give me some kind of release from the guilt. Did it? No. It just taught me that breaking beautiful things doesn't heal the soul, it only adds to the damage." Astrid picked up another fragment, feeling the smooth wood that had been shaped by patient hands. "But you kept the pieces." "Couldn't bring myself to burn them. They reminded me that even broken things can still carry beauty, can still have value." He looked at her directly then. "Perhaps someday I'll find a way to put them back together, make them whole again." The conversation was interrupted by a sound from outside, the distant whinny of a horse picking its way through the snow. Eirik was on his feet instantly, moving to the window with the fluid grace of someone whose survival had always depended on quick reactions. "3 riders," he said quietly, his voice taking on the hard edge of the warrior he had once been, "coming up the path from Ravenshollow." Astrid felt her stomach clench with sudden fear. "Magnus? No, these are scouts, probably sent to search for your body. Magnus wants proof that you died in the storm." Eirik was already moving, gathering weapons and supplies with practiced efficiency. "They'll search the areas most likely to shelter someone caught in the blizzard. This cabin is isolated, but it's also the obvious place for someone to seek refuge. What do we do?" "You hide. There's a root cellar beneath the floorboards. It's cold but concealed. I'll deal with the riders." He pulled up a section of the wooden floor, revealing a space carved from the living rock beneath the cabin. It was cramped, but deep enough to hide someone who didn't mind discomfort. "Wait," Astrid said, grasping his arm as he prepared to help her down into the hiding place. "What if they don't believe you? What if they search anyway? Then we'll face that when it happens. But right now, the safest place for you is somewhere they won't think to look." She descended into the root cellar, feeling the cold immediately seep through her borrowed clothes. Eirik replaced the floorboards above her, and suddenly she was in complete darkness, listening to the muffled sounds of preparation above. The space smelled of earth and stored food, and she found herself surrounded by sacks of grain and preserved meat, enough supplies to last through the worst of winter. The sound of approaching horses grew louder, then stopped outside the cabin. She heard heavy boots on the wooden steps, then a sharp knock on the door. "Eirik Stoneborn," came a voice she didn't recognize. "Open in the name of Jarl Magnus." The door creaked open, and she heard Eirik's measured response. "Gunnar, Olaf, Eirik the Red. What brings Magnus's hounds to my door?" "You know why we're here," the first voice replied Gunnar apparently. "There was an incident at the Jarl's wedding. His bride ran off into the storm. We're searching for the body." "Haven't seen anyone," Eirik said, his tone carefully disinterested. "Been snowed in for 3 days like everyone else." "Mind if we look around?" This was a different voice, younger and more aggressive. "Just to be thorough." There was a pause, and Astrid held her breath in the darkness below. "I mind very much," Eirik said finally, and she could hear steel in his voice. "This is my home. You're not welcome here without cause, and searching for a dead woman isn't cause enough." "Careful, Stoneborn," Gunnar warned. Your exile doesn't put you beyond Magnus's reach. He still remembers your service, but that protection has limits. My service ended when I chose to leave, Eirik replied. I owe Magnus nothing, and he owes me the respect due to any man who served him honorably. That includes the right to privacy in my own dwelling. The conversation continued above her, tense and careful, each man testing the boundaries of what could be said or done. Astrid pressed her ear to the floorboards, straining to hear every word, knowing that her life hung on the outcome of this verbal duel. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, she heard the boots moving away from the cabin. The horses departed, their hoofbeats gradually fading into the distance. Only then did the floorboards above her shift, and light flooded back into her hiding place. They're gone, Eirik said, helping her up from the cellar. Magnus won't give up easily. He can't afford to let word spread that someone defied him and lived. Astrid dusted off her borrowed clothes, her mind already working through the implications. Then, I can't stay here. I won't bring that danger to your door. Where would you go? Every settlement for 50 miles is under Magnus's control. The only safe place is somewhere he can't follow. She looked at him steadily. Or somewhere he wouldn't dare follow. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Outside, the sun shone on fresh snow, and the world looked clean and new. But beneath that pristine surface, old conflicts were stirring, and choices made in passion were about to carry consequences neither of them had fully considered. The revelation came 5 days later, delivered by an unexpected visitor who climbed the treacherous mountain path despite the lingering ice. Astrid was preparing the evening meal when Eirik's posture suddenly changed, his hand moving instinctively to the axe that hung near the door. "Someone's coming," he said quietly, alone, on foot, moving carefully. They waited in tense silence until a voice called out from beyond the door, an old woman's voice, cracked with age, but carrying unmistakable authority. "Eirik Stoneborn, I know you're in there, and I know you have something that belongs to me." Astrid felt her blood turn to ice. She recognized that voice from childhood memories, from stories told around winter fires when the nights were long and the boundaries between legend and truth grew thin. "Runa the Seer," Eirik breathed, and now Astrid could hear surprise in his voice, perhaps even fear. He opened the door to reveal a woman who seemed to embody winter itself, ancient beyond counting, with silver-white hair that fell to her waist and eyes the color of storm clouds. She carried herself with the authority of someone who had walked between worlds and returned with secrets that lesser mortals could never understand. In her gnarled hands she held a staff topped with carved runes that seemed to shift and change in the firelight. "Runa," Eirik said, offering a respectful bow, "you honor my humble dwelling." The old woman stepped inside, without invitation, her sharp gaze immediately finding Astrid where she stood frozen by the hearth. Those storm-grey eyes seemed to look through her, beyond the surface, to something deeper and more fundamental. "Astrid Thorn's daughter," Runa said, and it wasn't a question. "Daughter of Thorin the Just, granddaughter of Ingrid Ravenshield, bearer of blood that runs back to the first Jarls who ruled these lands." "I don't understand," Astrid managed, though something deep inside her was beginning to stir memories that weren't quite memories, knowledge that felt inherited rather than learned. Runa moved to the table where the fragments of Eirik's broken sculpture lay scattered. Without asking permission, she began arranging them in a pattern that Astrid found both familiar and strange. The pieces fit together in ways that hadn't been obvious before, creating not just a tree, but something more complex. A map, perhaps, or a genealogy traced in wood and carved symbol. "Your mother never told you," Runa said as she worked. "Probably thought she was protecting you from a burden you were too young to carry. But blood will tell, child, and yours is singing louder with every day that passes." "Told me what?" Astrid's voice came out as barely a whisper. The seer's ancient fingers moved among the wooden pieces with surprising dexterity, and suddenly the fragments locked together in a way that made perfect sense. What emerged wasn't just a carving of the world tree, it was a family tree, each branch representing a lineage, each carved symbol marking a generation of rulers who had shaped the northern lands. "You are not simply the daughter of a farmer who fell into debt," Runa said, her voice carrying the weight of absolute certainty. "You are the last living heir of Jarl Eirik the Wise, who ruled these lands before Magnus's father took them by force and treachery. Your grandmother Ingrid was Eirik's daughter, forced to flee when the old bloodlines were purged. She took a common name, married a good man, and tried to live quietly. But the blood of Jarls cannot be hidden forever." Astrid stared at the completed carving, seeing now how the intricate patterns told a story of conquest and exile, of hidden identities and patient waiting. Her hand moved unconsciously to where her mother's silver brooch had once rested, the tree symbol that she had always assumed was merely decorative. "The brooch," she said suddenly. "My mother's brooch with the tree. The seal of Eirik the Wise," Runa confirmed, "passed down through generations of women who hoped someday their children might reclaim what was stolen. Ingrid gave it to your mother, who was to give it to you when the time was right." Eirik had been listening in stunned silence, but now he spoke up. "Magnus destroyed it. When Astrid refused the marriage, he crushed it under his boot." Runa's expression darkened, and for a moment the temperature in the cabin seemed to drop. "Then he has committed an act of desecration that goes beyond mere cruelty. That brooch was not just jewelry, it was a sacred trust, a connection to the old laws and the rightful order of things." She turned back to Astrid, her storm-grey eyes intense. "Do you understand what this means, child? Magnus didn't try to marry you simply to gain another ally or secure another territory. He knew what you were, or suspected it. By making you his wife, he would have eliminated the last threat to his legitimacy. Your children would have carried his name, your bloodline would have been absorbed into his, and the old claims would have died forever." The implications crashed over Astrid like a cold wave. "He knew," she whispered. "Somehow, he knew what I was." "Magnus knows many things," Runa said grimly. "He has spies in places you would never suspect, and he understands the power of bloodlines in ways that few modern Jarls do. Your refusal to marry him wasn't just defiance, it was a declaration of war against his entire claim to these lands." Eirik moved to the window, scanning the landscape below with new urgency. "Then, those search parties weren't just looking for a dead bride. They were hunting the last rival to Magnus's throne." "Precisely," Runa said. "And when they discover that you live, that you know what you are, Magnus will move against you with everything he has. He cannot allow a legitimate heir to the old bloodline to remain free." Astrid sank into a chair, overwhelmed by the sudden transformation of her understanding. She had thought she was simply a farmer's daughter who had chosen dignity over safety. Now she discovered she was the last member of a royal line, the living embodiment of a claim to power that predated Magnus's rule by generations. "What am I supposed to do with this knowledge?" she asked. "I never wanted to be a ruler, I just wanted to be free." Runa's expression softened slightly. "Freedom and power are often the same thing, child. The old laws gave women rights that Magnus's regime has forgotten: the right to own land, to speak in councils, to choose their own paths. Your bloodline represents more than just a claim to leadership. It represents a different way of organizing the world, one where strength and wisdom matter more than fear and brutality." She gestured to the completed carving. This was never just Eirik's work, though he didn't know it when he carved it. The pattern came from dreams, from memories inherited in blood and bone. The world tree that connects all things, showing how past and present and future are woven together in ways we can barely comprehend. Eirik returned from the window, his face grim. "There are riders coming up the path, more than before, a dozen men, heavily armed." Runa nodded as if she had expected this. "Magnus grows impatient. He has learned that you survived, and now he comes to finish what the storm could not." She turned to Astrid, extending a small object wrapped in dark cloth. "This was your grandmother's. She asked me to hold it until the right moment came." Astrid unwrapped the cloth to reveal another brooch, nearly identical to the one Magnus had destroyed but older, its silver darkened with age. The tree symbol seemed to pulse with its own inner light, and when she pinned it to her dress, she felt something fundamental shift inside her, not just knowledge of who she was, but acceptance of what that meant. "The blood remembers," Runa said softly. "Even when the mind forgets, the blood remembers what it means to rule with wisdom rather than fear." Outside, the sound of approaching horses grew louder. Magnus had come in force this time, ready to end the threat that Astrid represented. But as she stood there with her ancestral brooch burning against her chest and the completed family tree before her, she realized something had changed. She was no longer running from Magnus Ironwolf. She was preparing to face him as his equal and perhaps, if the old laws still held any power in this harsh land, as his superior. The greatest battle of her life was about to begin, but for the first time since the night of her refusal, Astrid Thornsdottir felt ready to fight. The sound of armored men climbing the mountain path filled the cabin with urgent tension. Runa moved to the window, her weathered face set in grim lines as she counted the approaching force. 15 men, she announced. "Magnus himself rides with them. He's brought his best warriors. This isn't a search party anymore. It's an execution squad." Eirik was already moving, gathering weapons with the practiced efficiency of someone who had prepared for this moment many times over. He strapped on the sword he hadn't worn since leaving Magnus's service, its familiar weight settling against his hip like an old friend returning home. From a hidden compartment behind the fireplace, he retrieved a mail shirt and battle axe that spoke of years of careful maintenance despite disuse. "There's another path down the back of the mountain," he said to Astrid, "treacherous, especially with ice, but it leads to the old hunting lodge. If you leave now—" "No," Astrid said firmly, her hand moving to the ancient brooch that now rested against her chest. Something had changed in her since Runa's revelation, a straightening of the spine that spoke of awakening purpose. "I'm done running. If Magnus wants to face me, then let him come." "Child," Runa said gently, "bravery is admirable, but wisdom recognizes when retreat serves a greater purpose. You cannot reclaim your birthright if you're dead." Astrid looked at the completed carving on the table, the world tree that was also her family tree, each carved branch representing generations of rulers who had faced impossible choices. "My grandmother fled. My mother lived in hiding. How many generations of women have run from men like Magnus, hoping that someone else would eventually stand up to them?" She moved to the window, watching the armed riders pick their way carefully up the icy slope. At their head rode a figure she recognized even at this distance, Magnus Ironwolf himself, his wolf-pelt cloak and burnished armor making him unmistakable. He had come personally to finish what he'd started in the Great Hall. "Besides," Astrid continued, "where would I run to? He controls every settlement, every safe haven, every place where people might offer shelter. Sooner or later, I'd have to face him. Better to do it here, where I choose the ground." Eirik studied her with new respect. "You've changed since that night in the storm. There's something different about you." "I know who I am now," she replied simply. "Not just Astrid the farmer's daughter, but Astrid of the line of Eirik the Wise. That carries responsibilities I can't abandon." Runa nodded approvingly. "The blood speaks truly, but knowing your heritage and claiming your throne are different things entirely. Magnus has held power for 20 years through fear and violence. He won't simply step aside because you have the stronger legal claim." "Then what do you suggest?" The old seer smiled, and for the first time since her arrival, there was something almost predatory in her expression. "We remind him of laws older than his rule, customs that even he cannot simply ignore without losing the support of other Jarls." She moved to her travel pack and withdrew several objects wrapped in dark cloth. The first was an ancient horn, carved with runes and bound with silver wire. The second was a crown, not the elaborate golden circlet that Magnus wore, but something far older and simpler, made of dark metal and set with stones that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. The Horn of Succession, Runa explained, holding up the first artifact. When blown by one with rightful claim, it calls for a formal challenge under the old laws. No Jarl can refuse such a summons without losing face before his peers. And the crown? The iron crown of Eirik the Wise, hidden for 20 years, waiting for his heir to reclaim it. Magnus wears gold because it's beautiful and expensive. Your ancestor wore iron because it was strong and enduring. Astrid reached out to touch the crown, feeling the cold metal warm under her fingers. It was smaller than she had expected, designed for function rather than display, but she could sense the weight of history it carried. If I challenge him formally, what then? Single combat? Under the old laws, a challenge can take several forms, Runa explained. Combat is one option, but not the only one. A ruler can also be challenged on the basis of wisdom, justice, or the support of the people. Magnus is a warrior in straight combat. Even Eirik might struggle against him, but there are other battlegrounds where his weaknesses might serve you better. Eirik moved away from the window. They're almost here. Whatever we're going to do, we need to decide quickly. Astrid looked around the cabin that had been her sanctuary, at the man who had saved her life, at the ancient woman who had revealed her destiny. For a moment, doubt crept in. She was still barely 20 years old, with no experience of leadership or politics beyond a farmer's daughter's understanding. What made her think she could face down the most powerful man in the Northern Territories? Then she remembered the night of her refusal, standing in Magnus's great hall with 300 pairs of eyes, watching her choose dignity over safety. She had found her voice then, speaking truth in a place where lies were easier. If she could do it once, she could do it again. "Tell me about the challenge laws," she said to Runa. "All of them." As the seer explained the ancient protocols, Astrid began to understand the true genius of her ancestors' legal system. It wasn't designed simply to determine who was strongest or most ruthless. It was meant to ensure that rulers actually served their people's needs. A challenge could be based on the welfare of the common folk, on the protection of the weak, on the preservation of justice and tradition. Magnus rules through fear, she said thoughtfully. His people obey him because they're afraid of what he'll do if they don't. But fear isn't the same thing as loyalty or respect. No, Eirik agreed. I've seen how his own warriors look at him when they think he's not watching. There's obedience there, but little love. Men follow him because he pays them well, and because crossing him means death, not because they believe in his cause. Then that's his weakness, Astrid said. He's built his power on foundations that can't bear the weight of genuine opposition. The sound of horses stopping outside made all conversation halt. Heavy boots climbed the wooden steps, and then Magnus's voice rang out, carrying the authority he had wielded unchallenged for 2 decades. "Eirik Stoneborn, I know you have something that belongs to me. Send out the woman, and I might allow you to live." Eirik moved to the door but didn't open it. "I have nothing that belongs to you, Magnus. Only what I choose to protect. The girl is mine by right of contract and law. Her father signed the agreements. The marriage was blessed by the gods. Her refusal means nothing. She is still my wife in all ways that matter." "Except the ways that matter most," Astrid called out, her voice carrying clearly through the thick wooden door. "The ways that require consent rather than force, respect rather than ownership." The silence that followed was profound. Then Magnus laughed, but there was no humor in the sound. "So the little bird has found her voice again. Come out, Astrid. Let's finish what we started in the great hall." Astrid picked up the Horn of Succession, feeling its weight in her hands. Such a small thing to carry such enormous consequences. One blow of this horn would change everything. would declare her identity to the world and force Magnus to face her under laws he couldn't simply ignore. "Are you ready for this?" Eirik asked quietly. "Once you blow that horn, there's no going back. You'll be committed to seeing this through to the end." "I was committed the moment I said no in his hall," Astrid replied. "The only difference is that now I understand what I was really refusing." She moved to the door, Runa beside her with the iron crown, Eirik at her back with weapons ready. Outside, 15 armed men waited in the snow, led by a tyrant who had never been successfully challenged in all his years of rule. But inside the cabin, 3 people prepared to remind the world that some claims to power ran deeper than fear, that some laws were older than tyranny, and that sometimes the most dangerous opponent was the one who had nothing left to lose. Astrid raised the horn of succession to her lips, drew a deep breath, and prepared to blow a note that would echo through the mountains and summon forces that had slept for 20 years. The final battle for the Northern Territories was about to begin. The sound of the horn of succession cut through the mountain air like the voice of destiny itself, deep, resonant, carrying harmonics that seemed to awaken echoes in the very stones beneath their feet. It was a sound that had not been heard in these lands for 20 years. As the note faded, leaving only wind and silence in its wake, Astrid felt the weight of history settling on her shoulders like a mantle made of starlight and steel. She stepped out of the cabin, the iron crown in her hands, Runa and Eirik flanking her like ancient guardians. The sight that greeted her was everything she had expected and nothing she was prepared for. Magnus sat his warhorse at the head of his warriors, 15 of the most dangerous men in the Northern Territories, arranged behind him in a crescent of steel and leather and barely controlled violence. But it was Magnus himself who commanded attention. Up close, away from the political theatre of his great hall, he was even more formidable than she remembered. His wolf-pelt cloak moved in the wind like a living thing, and the golden crown on his head caught the pale sunlight with an arrogance that spoke of absolute confidence. His pale blue eyes, cold as winter fjords, fixed on her with the intensity of a predator that had finally cornered its prey. "So," he said, his voice carrying easily across the snow-covered clearing, "the horn of succession. I wondered when someone would be foolish enough to try that particular gambit." "Not foolish," Astrid replied, her voice steady despite the way her heart hammered against her ribs. "Faithful to laws that are older than your rule. Magnus Ironwolf." She raised the iron crown so that all could see it, and was gratified to see several of the warriors shift uneasily in their saddles. Whatever Magnus had told them about this expedition, they hadn't expected to be confronted with symbols of the old royal line. "I am Astrid, daughter of Thorin, granddaughter of Ingrid Ravenshield, great-granddaughter of Jarl Eirik the Wise, who ruled these lands before your father took them by treachery and murder." Her voice grew stronger with each word, carrying across the clearing with newfound authority. "I claim the throne that is mine, by blood and birth and right. I challenge your rule under the ancient laws of succession." The silence that followed was profound. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath while Magnus processed what he was hearing. Then he threw back his head and laughed a sound like rocks grinding together in an avalanche. "Eirik the Wise," he said, shaking his head in apparent amazement. "That old fool's line died out years ago. Everyone knows that. Everyone was told that." Runa stepped forward, her staff planted firmly in the snow. "But truth and common knowledge are often different things, as you well know." Magnus's expression darkened at the sight of the old seer. "Runa the Mad, I should have known you'd be involved in this farce, still filling young heads with stories about the old days. Are you? Still ignoring laws that inconvenience you, are you?" Runa replied sharply. "The horn has been blown, the challenge has been issued. Under the ancient customs, you must respond according to the protocols established by your own ancestors." "My ancestors," Magnus said, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper, "conquered these lands with blood and iron. They didn't waste time with dusty laws and meaningless ceremonies. "Your father overthrew Eirik the Wise through betrayal," Astrid said, stepping forward. "He invited him to a feast under the banner of truce, then had him murdered along with his sons. The only survivors were women and children who fled into exile. History is written by the victors," Magnus replied. "Whatever my father did, he won. That makes him right." "Does it?" Astrid asked. "Then let history judge us both. Accept my challenge, and we'll see what the gods think of your claim versus mine." For a moment, genuine uncertainty flickered across Magnus's face. He was a man who had built his power on force and fear, but even he couldn't simply ignore the ancient laws in front of witnesses. Other Jarls would hear about this confrontation, and if he refused a legitimate challenge, it would raise questions about the foundation of his rule. "What form does this challenge take?" he asked finally, his tone carefully controlled. "That choice is yours," Runa said, reciting the ancient protocols. "Combat, wisdom, justice, or the judgment of the people. As the one challenged, you may choose the battlefield." Magnus smiled then, and the expression was like winter sunlight on a blade's edge, beautiful and utterly cold. "Combat, then. Single combat to the death. That's the only law I've ever respected." Astrid had expected this choice, but hearing it spoken aloud still sent ice through her veins. Magnus was not just a politician or administrator, he was a warrior who had earned his reputation in countless battles. Even with Eirik's training, even with the righteousness of her cause, the odds of defeating him in single combat were desperately slim. But before she could respond, Eirik stepped forward. "The ancient laws allow for champions," he said quietly. "If Lady Astrid accepts my service, I will fight in her name." Magnus's smile widened. "Of course you will. The exile and the pretender standing together against the natural order. How poetic." He dismounted from his warhorse with fluid grace, drawing a sword that gleamed like captured starlight. The blade was magnificent, longer and heavier than most men could wield effectively, perfectly balanced for someone with Magnus's size and strength. "I accept your champion, little bird," he said to Astrid. "But know this, when I've finished with your protector, I'll deal with you personally. The marriage contract still stands, and I mean to see it fulfilled." The clearing transformed into an impromptu arena, Magnus's warriors forming a circle while Eirik prepared for battle. The duel began with the sound of steel meeting steel, a ringing note that echoed off the mountain peaks like the voice of fate itself. Eirik and Magnus circled each other in the makeshift arena, two warriors whose paths had diverged years ago, now brought together by the choices of a woman who refused to be owned. Magnus fought with the confidence of someone who had never truly been challenged. His sword moved in precise arcs, each strike calculated to test his opponent's defenses while revealing nothing of his own capabilities. He was fighting strategically, probing for weaknesses, waiting for the moment when Eirik's age or isolation or moral qualms would create an opening. Eirik, for his part, fought with the careful efficiency of someone who had learned that survival mattered more than glory. His movements were economical, defensive, designed to conserve strength while gathering information about his opponent's style. Where Magnus sought to dominate through overwhelming force, Eirik looked for the subtle angles, the patient opportunities that came to those who knew how to wait. "You've grown soft in your mountain retreat," Magnus taunted as their blades locked near the hilts. "The Eirik I remember would have pressed the attack by now." "The Eirik you remember served a cause he believed in," Eirik replied, breaking the lock and stepping back. "This time, I'm fighting for something that actually matters." The comment struck home. For just an instant, Magnus's perfect composure slipped, revealing something raw and angry underneath. His next attack came with more force than strategy, a series of powerful overhead strikes that forced Eirik to give ground. Astrid watched from the edge of the circle, her hand clutched around the iron crown, her heart keeping time with the clash of weapons. She could see the toll the combat was taking on both men, the careful breathing, the slight tremor in hands that gripped weapons too tightly, the gradual accumulation of small cuts and bruises that spoke of strikes that had come too close. "He's stronger," Runa said quietly beside her, "but strength isn't everything." "What do you mean?" "Magnus fights like a man who has never truly lost anything. Eirik fights like someone who knows the cost of failure." The old seer's voice carried certainty. "One of those perspectives makes you careful. The other makes you dangerous." As if summoned by her words, the character of the duel began to shift. Magnus, confident in his superior strength and skill, began to take chances, aggressive attacks that left him briefly exposed, combinations that relied on overwhelming his opponent rather than outthinking him. Each exchange left him slightly more winded, slightly less precise. Eirik, meanwhile, seemed to be finding his rhythm. His movements became more fluid, more instinctive, as muscle memory from decades of combat reasserted itself. He was no longer the exile who had walked away from war. He was the warrior who had earned Magnus's respect in the first place, fighting now for a cause that restored meaning to his skills. The turning point came when Magnus overextended on a particularly aggressive thrust. Eirik sidestepped, letting the blade pass harmlessly by, then brought the pommel of his own sword down hard on Magnus's wrist. The larger man's grip faltered for just an instant, but it was enough. Eirik's blade found the gap in Magnus's armor, sliding between the metal plates to draw first blood. Magnus roared in pain and fury, stumbling back as red spread across his side. The wound wasn't fatal, but it was significant proof that he could be hurt, that his reputation for invincibility was just another lie, he told himself. "First blood to the challenger's champion," Runa announced, her voice carrying the authority of ancient law. "Magnus Ironwolf, do you yield?" "Never," Magnus snarled, though his breathing was labored now, his movements less confident. But something fundamental had changed. The circle of watching warriors began to murmur among themselves, and Astrid could see doubt creeping into faces that had shown only certainty before. Magnus had been wounded by a man he claimed was past his prime, a warrior who had supposedly grown soft in exile. If their invincible Jarl could be hurt by such an opponent, what did that say about his claims to superiority? The final exchange came suddenly. Magnus, desperate to end the fight before his strength failed entirely, launched himself forward in a reckless charge. His sword swept in a wide arc that would have split Eirik from shoulder to hip if it had connected. Instead, Eirik dropped to one knee, letting the blade pass over his head, then drove his own sword upward with all his remaining strength. The point found the gap between Magnus's chestplate and shoulder guard, sliding through leather and flesh to pierce the heart beneath. Magnus stood frozen for a moment, his sword falling from nerveless fingers, his face showing not pain but profound surprise. Then he collapsed, the man who had ruled through fear and violence brought down by someone fighting for love and justice. In the sudden silence that followed, Astrid stepped forward and placed the iron crown on her own head. The weight of it felt both foreign and familiar, like coming home after a long journey. "Magnus Ironwolf is dead," she announced, her voice carrying to every corner of the clearing. "I claim the throne that is mine by right of blood and victory. Who among you will acknowledge the rightful heir of Eirik the Wise?" Spring came early to the northern territories that year, as if the land itself were eager to wash away the memories of the longest winter in living memory. From the great hall of Ravenshollow, now restored to its original name of Eriksholm, Astrid could see green returning to the hillsides and wildflowers blooming in meadows that had been buried under snow during the darkest days of Magnus's reign. 6 months had passed since the duel that changed everything. 6 months of careful rebuilding, of earning trust that had been shattered by decades of rule through fear. It hadn't been easy. Some of Magnus's former allies had resisted the transition, requiring delicate negotiations and occasionally stronger measures. But the old ways were reasserting themselves, and the people were beginning to remember what it felt like to be governed rather than merely controlled. Astrid stood before the great hearth where she had once been forced to dress for a wedding she refused, but now the room had been transformed. Gone were the ostentatious displays of wealth and power that Magnus had favoured. In their place were practical furnishings that spoke of competence rather than intimidation, and the walls bore tapestries depicting the region's history, including the dark years of Magnus's rule, which Astrid insisted be remembered as well as celebrated. In her hands, she held a letter that had arrived that morning from the northern Jarls, acknowledging her rule and requesting her presence at the spring assembly where territorial boundaries and trade agreements would be negotiated. It was exactly the kind of tedious but essential work that Magnus had always delegated to subordinates, but Astrid understood that true leadership required attention to such details. "The delegation from Birchwood has arrived," Eirik announced from the doorway. He wore the simple clothes of a councillor now rather than a warrior's gear, though his sword remained within easy reach. Old habits died hard. "They're requesting an audience about the fishing rights dispute." Astrid nodded, setting the letter aside. "Have them shown to the council chamber, and ask Runa to join us. Her knowledge of the old boundary laws will be helpful." The past months had taught her that ruling was far more complex than she had imagined during those days in the cabin. Every decision created ripple effects, every judgment set precedents that would influence future cases. She had learned to listen more than she spoke, to consider consequences beyond the immediate problem, to balance justice with pragmatism in ways that would have seemed impossible when she was simply a farmer's daughter refusing an unwanted marriage. But there were rewards as well. The reports that reached her from throughout the territory spoke of improvements that would have been impossible under Magnus's rule. Villages that had lived in constant fear now held festivals again. Women walked to market without guards. Children played in fields that had once been too dangerous for anything but armed patrols. "The people trust you," Eirik said, joining her at the window. "They see you as someone who understands their concerns because you lived among them." "Do they?" Astrid asked. "Sometimes I wonder if they simply prefer me to the alternative. Fear of change can look very much like loyalty." "You're not Magnus," Eirik said firmly. "That alone is worth celebrating." They stood together in comfortable silence, watching the activity in the courtyard below. Merchants haggling over prices, children chasing geese between the buildings, servants going about their daily tasks without the tension that had marked the final years of the previous regime. It was ordinary life, unremarkable and precious, the kind of peaceful existence that Magnus's rule had made impossible. "There's something I need to tell you," Eirik said eventually, his tone growing more serious. "The southern Jarls have been asking questions about us, about our relationship." Astrid felt heat rise in her cheeks. The attraction between them had been obvious for months, growing stronger as they worked together to rebuild the territory. But they had both been careful not to let personal feelings interfere with the delicate process of establishing her legitimacy as a ruler. "What kind of questions?" "The kind that rulers have always faced when they remained unmarried too long. They want to know if you plan to take a husband, whether you'll produce an heir, how the succession will be managed." He paused, then continued more gently. "They want to know if I'm more than just your counselor." Astrid turned to face him fully, seeing in his weathered features the same careful strength that had saved her life that night in the storm. They had been through so much together: the desperate flight from Magnus's hall, the revelation of her heritage, the final confrontation that had changed their world. Through it all, he had been her anchor, the steady presence that reminded her of her own worth when doubt crept in. "What do you think?" she asked quietly. Instead of answering with words, Eirik reached into his pocket and withdrew something wrapped in soft leather. When he unfolded the covering, Astrid gasped. It was her mother's silver brooch, the one Magnus had crushed under his boot that terrible night. But it had been repaired, the broken pieces carefully fitted back together, and the damaged sections replaced with new silver that gleamed brighter than the original. "I found the pieces after the duel," he explained. "Spent the winter learning silversmithing from old Henrik in the village. It's not exactly as it was, you can still see where it broke, but it's whole again. Stronger, maybe, for having been tested." Astrid took the brooch with trembling fingers, feeling the familiar weight of her heritage, but also something new. The promise that broken things could be mended, that damage didn't have to be permanent, that love could create beauty, even from shattered dreams. "Like us," she said softly. "Like us," he agreed. As she pinned the restored brooch to her dress, Astrid realized that this was what victory truly looked like. Not the dramatic moment of Magnus's defeat or the ceremony where she claimed her crown, but this quiet morning when two people who had lost everything discovered they had found something worth keeping. Outside, spring continued its gentle conquest of winter, and in the great hall of Eriksholm, the future began to take shape in the space between one heartbeat and the next.